The Chicago rain fell in a relentless, shimmering sheet, blurring the gas lamps along Michigan Avenue into hazy constellations. Inside the polished black shell of a Pierre motorcar, Evelyn Hayes watched the city dissolve into a watercolor of light and shadow. The scent of damp wool from her chauffeur's coat mingled with the lingering perfume of gardenias from the charity gala she had just endured. It was a scent she associated with duty, with the gilded cage her father, Walter Hayes, had so meticulously constructed around her. At 22, Evelyn was the city's darling, a porcelain doll draped in beaded silks and ropes of pearls. Tonight, she wore a sheath of silver lame that whispered against the plush leather seats, its fringed hem a silent testament to the reckless spirit of the age, a spirit she was only allowed to observe, never to embody. Her hair, a gleaming black bob, was held in place by a diamond band that felt less like an ornament and more like a crown of thorns. Every smile she had offered tonight, every polite laugh that had escaped her perfectly painted lips, had been a performance for the benefit of her father's associates. She was his most valuable asset, a symbol of his untouchable power, and she felt the weight of that role like a physical shroud. The engine of the Pierce purred, a low, contented sound that was the anthem of her sheltered life. It was a sound of safety, of predictability. As they turned off the Grand Avenue onto a quieter, cobbled side street, a route the driver took to avoid the worst of the traffic, a dark shape suddenly materialized from the downpour. A Ford Model T, its headlights cutting through the deluge like angry eyes, swerved to block their path. Evelyn's chauffeur, a stout man named Clarence, who had been with the family for a decade, swore under his breath and slammed on the brakes. The Pierce skidded on the wet stones, its tires groaning in protest before coming to an abrupt halt mere inches from the other vehicle's bumper. "Stay in the car, Miss Hayes," Clarence ordered, his voice tight with a tension Evelyn had never heard before. Before he could even open his door, two figures emerged from the gloom on either side of their car. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace, their long dark coats slick with rain, the brims of their fedoras pulled low to obscure their faces. One man tapped the driver's window with the barrel of a pistol. The metallic sound was sharp and final, cutting through the drumming of the rain. Clarence slowly raised his hands, his face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. The door on Evelyn's side was wrenched open. A blast of cold, damp air flooded the warm interior, carrying with it the scent of wet asphalt and something else, the clean, sharp smell of danger. A man leaned in. She could not see his eyes, but she felt their weight upon her. He said nothing, simply gestured with a gloved hand. The command was absolute. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of her composure. This was the raw, brutal side of Chicago her father navigated with such ruthless precision, a world she had only read about in sensational newspaper headlines. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a cage. Yet years of conditioning, of being told that a Hayes never showed weakness, held her scream in her throat. She would not give them the satisfaction. She moved with a deliberate, almost regal slowness, gathering the silver fabric of her dress. As she stepped out onto the glistening cobblestones, her silk-wrapped heel catching for a moment, the man's hand shot out, not to harm her, but to steady her arm. The touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a tremor of shock from her. It was a gesture of assistance. It was utterly, terrifyingly incongruous. She was guided to the Ford T, its engine rumbling like a caged beast. Clarence was being pulled from the driver's seat, a cloth sack shoved over his head. They beat him. They were efficient, silent, and unnervingly professional. Evelyn was pushed into the back of the Ford, the door closing behind her with a solid thud that sealed her fate. One man slid in beside her, the other took the wheel. and the car lurched forward, leaving her father's Pierce Sarrow abandoned in the rain like a discarded toy. The journey was a blur of dark alleys and unfamiliar streets. The man beside her remained silent, a statue of wet wool and steel. Evelyn sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind a maelstrom of fear. She thought of her father. His rage would be biblical. He did not tolerate threats. He annihilated them. But would his first thought be for her safety, or for the insult to his power? The question, and her inability to answer it with certainty, was the most painful part of her terror. Finally the car slowed and pulled into a covered alleyway, stopping before a discreet, unmarked steel door. She was led out of the car, and through the door into a service corridor that smelled of polish and old secrets. They ascended in a small, wood-paneled elevator, the silence broken only by the quiet hum of its mechanics. When the doors opened, it was not to a damp cellar or a derelict warehouse, but to a lavishly carpeted hallway. They stopped before a set of imposing mahogany doors. One of her captors knocked twice, a sharp, concise rap. A voice from within, low and steady, answered, "Enter." The door swung open, and she was gently nudged inside. The room was a large private study, a sanctuary of masculine elegance. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, their spines gleaming in the soft glow of a green-tasseled banker's lamp. A fire crackled in a grand marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across a thick Persian rug. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the faint aromatic smoke of a Turkish cigarette. And there, standing by the fireplace, was him. He was not what she had expected. The newspapers depicted gangsters as brutish thugs in ill-fitting suits, with faces like crumpled maps of violence. This man was different. He was tall and lean, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that spoke of wealth, not thuggery. His dark hair was slicked back from a high forehead, and his face was a study in sharp angles and quiet intensity. He held a cigarette between his long fingers, its tip a glowing ember in the dim light. But it was his eyes that captured her, the color of whiskey, intelligent and unnervingly calm. They held no malice, no overt threat, only a deep, penetrating stillness that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling from his lips as he watched her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and unvoiced fears. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a low baritone, smooth and controlled. It was not the growl of a street tough, but the measured cadence of an educated man. "I am Arthur Vance. Please have a seat. You must be chilled." He gestured to a plush armchair near the fire. His men melted back into the shadows of the hallway, closing the doors behind them and leaving the two of them alone. Evelyn remained standing, her body rigid with defiance and fear. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice coming out stronger than she felt, the practiced coolness of a society heiress serving her one last time. Arthur Vance crushed his cigarette in a crystal ashtray on the mantelpiece. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, no wasted gestures. "What I want," he began, turning to face her fully, "is a conversation with your father. You, Miss Hayes, are simply the invitation. My father does not negotiate with criminals." The words were automatic, a line she had heard her father speak a dozen times. A faint, mirthless smile touched Arthur's lips. "That is a matter of perspective. In his world he is a titan of industry. In mine, he is a man with a debt, a very old debt that has come due." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. "You are not a hostage for ransom, if that's what you're thinking. I have no need of your father's money. You are collateral, a guarantee that he will finally listen." The sheer audacity of his calm pronouncement stole her breath. He spoke of her as if she were a stock certificate, a deed to a property. The cold, impersonal nature of it was more frightening than any threat of violence. She had expected a monster, and she had found a strategist. And what if he refuses to listen? She challenged, lifting her chin. Arthur's expression did not change, but a flicker of something dark and ancient passed through his eyes. Then he will have made a grave miscalculation. He will have valued his pride more than his daughter, and I will be forced to collect my debt in a different manner. The unspoken threat hung in the air, more potent for its vagueness. He took a step closer, and Evelyn instinctively flinched. He stopped, a flicker of what might have been regret in his eyes before it was gone. "I have no intention of harming you, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You are a guest here, albeit an unwilling one. You will be treated with respect, but do not mistake my civility for weakness. Your fate rests entirely in your father's hands." He turned and walked towards a decanter of amber liquid on a nearby table. "A brandy, perhaps, to warm you?" "No," she whispered, her throat tight. He nodded, as if expecting the answer. He poured a small amount for himself, swirling the liquid in the glass. "Very well. You will be shown to your rooms. They're comfortable. You will find everything you need." The placid domestic words were the most terrifying of all. Rooms, as if this were a weekend stay at a country estate, as if she were not a prisoner at the heart of a war she was only just beginning to understand. As he turned back, the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, and for a fleeting moment Evelyn saw past the gangster and the strategist. She saw a man haunted by a deep, abiding sorrow, a man whose entire existence was fueled by a fire that had been lit long before she was ever born. And in that moment, she knew her carefully controlled world had not just been broken, it had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. The rooms she was led to were not a cell, but a gilded cage, more luxurious than any she had ever known. A formidable man with a face like carved granite, introduced only as Frank, escorted her from Arthur's study to a suite at the end of the hall. He unlocked the door and stood aside, his presence a silent, unmovable wall. Evelyn stepped inside, and her breath caught. She had expected damp stone and a single cot. Instead, she found a sitting room furnished with a velvet chaise lounge, a small writing desk of dark cherry wood, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of Chicago's glittering skyline. The lights of the city spread out below like a carpet of fallen stars, a beautiful, sprawling world that was now utterly beyond her reach. An adjoining bedroom held a four-poster bed draped in cream-colored silk, and the bathroom was a vision of black and white marble with gleaming gold fixtures. It was a prison designed to break the spirit, not with hardship, but with an agonizing imitation of freedom. "Your meals will be brought to you 3 times a day," Frank stated, his voice a low rumble. "Any other requests can be made through the house phone." He pointed to a black telephone on the desk. "It does not connect to an outside line." With a final, assessing look, he stepped back and pulled the heavy door shut. Evelyn listened, expecting the harsh, grating sound of a bolt being thrown. Instead, there was only the soft, decisive click of the lock. She rushed to the door and turned the handle. It was, of course, immobile. She was trapped in splendor. The first 24 hours passed in a haze of disbelief and simmering fear. She explored every inch of her prison, testing the windows they were sealed, examining the contents of the small, curated library, poetry by Millais, novels by Wharton, a collection of Greek tragedies, and lifting the lid of the handsome mahogany gramophone. A stack of records sat beside it, the wailing clarinet of a jazz ensemble, the mournful cry of a blues singer, the soaring crescendo of a symphony. It was a collection of exquisite taste. His taste, she presumed. She refused the first meal that was brought to her, a silent act of defiance that went entirely unacknowledged. The tray was simply left, then collected an hour later, untouched. By evening, hunger had gnawed away at her resolve, and she ate the simple but delicious roasted chicken that was served for dinner, feeling a hot flush of shame at her own weakness. He did not come that first day, and his absence was a presence in itself, a weight in the silent, perfumed air of the suite. She was his captive, yet he left her to the torment of her own thoughts. He appeared on the second evening. There was no knock. The lock simply clicked, and he was there, standing in the doorway, holding a tray himself. He was dressed less formally than before, in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, capable wrists. He moved with the same quiet confidence, placing the tray on a small table by the chaise lounge. "I thought you might prefer this to Frank's service," he said, his whiskey-colored eyes taking in the room, then settling on her. She was standing by the window, a book held tightly in her hands as if it were a shield. "He lacks a certain finesse." "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn asked, her voice tight. "This kindness. It's a crueler torture than a dungeon would be." "It is not meant as kindness, nor as torture," Arthur replied, his voice even. He gestured to the food. "It is merely a practical matter. A starved guest is of no use to me. Please, eat." She did not move. He watched her for a moment longer, then walked over to the bookshelf. He ran a finger along the spines, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I see you found Edna's Vincent Millay. My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night." A fitting sentiment for our generation, don't you think? His observation caught her off guard. Her father saw books as decoration, a sign of established wealth. He had never once discussed their contents with her. "I suppose it is," she managed, her grip on the book tightening. "A generation that danced its way out of one war and seems to be drinking its way into another." Arthur turned from the bookshelf, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. "You don't strike me as the typical flapper, Miss Hayes. Your father's papers paint you as a socialite, concerned only with the length of your pearls and the quality of the champagne. The papers print what my father wants them to print," she retorted, a bitter edge to her voice. "He prefers his daughter to be an ornament, not a conversation partner." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate and revealing than she had intended. For the first time, Arthur's carefully neutral expressions softened into something resembling understanding. "Then he is a fool," he said simply. He walked to the gramophone and picked up a record. "Do you care for music?" Without waiting for an answer, he placed the black disc on the turntable and carefully lowered the needle. A lone trumpet cried out, a sound full of longing and sorrow, before being joined by the slow, mournful rhythm of a piano. The melody filled the room, a bluesy lament that spoke of smoky rooms, lost love, and the endless loneliness of a city at night. They stood in silence, listening, separated by the widths of the room, but connected by the haunting music. It was a language they both understood. This became their ritual. Each evening, Arthur would come to her rooms. Sometimes he brought her tray. Other times, he simply appeared after she had eaten. He would put a record on the gramophone, and they would talk. The conversations began tentatively, circling the safe territories of literature and art, but soon spiraled into deeper, more dangerous waters. They debated the merits of abstract paintings she had only seen in magazines, the tragic endings of novels they had both read, the intoxicating promise of jazz. She learned that his quiet demeanor hid a sharp, incisive mind. He was largely self-educated, having devoured books in public libraries during a youth he never spoke of directly. Yet he could dismantle a philosophical argument with the same precision he likely used to plan a heist. He listened to her opinions with a focused intensity that made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly seen. He was not her captor in those moments. He was simply a man, and she, a woman, locked in a strange suspended reality. One evening, she found the courage to ask a more personal question. "You built all this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the opulent room, "the city beyond the glass. The papers call you a king in the underworld. Why?" He was standing by the window, looking down at the city that was his kingdom. The lights reflected in his eyes, making them seem deep and distant. "When you have nothing," he said, his voice low, "you learn that there are two kinds of power in this world. The kind you are born with, inherited, clean, and respected, and the kind you must take for yourself, forged in filth and desperation. The second kind is stronger. It has to be." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Your father understands this. He just pretends his power is of the first kind." The remark was a sharp reminder of her situation, of the chasm of hatred that separated their worlds. And yet, instead of fear, she felt a pang of something else, a startling, unwelcome flutter of attraction. It was a dangerous, insidious thing, born in the solitude of her velvet cage. It was in the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when a passage of a book amused him, the low timbre of his voice when he spoke about a piece of music he loved, the startling intelligence that burned behind his calm facade. She was falling for the monster in the fairy tale, but the more she saw of him, the more she realized he was not a monster at all. He was a man, shaped by a pain she couldn't comprehend, a man who spoke the language of her soul, even as he held her prisoner. That night, long after he had gone, and the soft click of the lock had once again sealed her in, Evelyn lay awake in her silk-draped bed. The distant sound of a saxophone drifted up from the city streets below, a lonely, searching melody. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her own heart. She had to admit a terrifying truth to herself in the darkness of her luxurious cell. The frantic beat was no longer just from fear. It was from the dizzying, terrifying anticipation of hearing that lock click open again. A week bled into two, and the velvet cage became a strange sort of sanctuary. The conversations with Arthur were the axis on which Evelyn's new world turned. He never spoke of her father, nor of the debt he was owed. He spoke of art, of the world, of ideas. He unwrapped her mind, layer by layer, finding not the vapid debutante he had expected, but a sharp, hungry intellect starved for stimulation. For his part, Evelyn discovered the man beneath the gangster's iron control. She saw the ghost of a lonely boy who had found solace in books, and the ruthlessness of a man who had clawed his way to power with nothing but his wits and an unquenchable fire for vengeance. The attraction between them simmered, a dangerous, unspoken current in the still air of the suite. It was a traitorous feeling, a vine of ivy growing over the ruins of her old life, beautiful and destructive all at once. One evening, he put on a record by a new Creole genius from New Orleans. The sound that spilled from the gramophone's horn was unlike anything she had heard before, a jubilant, chaotic, and profoundly alive explosion of brass and piano. It was the sound of freedom. Evelyn closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm. "I wish I could hear it properly," she whispered, more to herself than to him, not through a needle and a horn, but in the air. "I wish I could feel it." Arthur stopped in the middle of pouring himself a brandy. He watched her, his face a mask of contemplation. He saw the longing in the line of her throat, the way her fingers tapped restlessly against her arm. For 2 weeks he had kept her here, a perfectly preserved butterfly under glass. He had told himself it was a strategic necessity, but now, watching her, he was forced to admit a more complicated truth. He was captivated by her. He had captured the daughter of his enemy, only to find himself, in a way, her prisoner. "Your father," he said, his voice quiet, "kept you away from all of this, the jazz, the speakeasies, the real pulse of the city." "He calls it degenerate," Evelyn said, opening her eyes. He believes a woman's reputation is as fragile as glass. He prefers the symphony ordered, predictable, passionless. In that moment, a reckless, dangerous idea took root in Arthur's mind. It was a strategic folly, a breach of his own rigid security, and an act of profound self-indulgence. It was madness. "Get your coat," he said, the decision made. Evelyn stared at him, her heart giving a sudden violent lurch. "What? There's a place, a cellar club, in the Levy district. They wouldn't dare refuse me entry. And no one there would ever speak a word to your father's people." He walked to the suite's wardrobe and pulled out a simple, dark wool coat and a plain cloche hat that had been provided for her. "These will be better than what you arrived in. Less conspicuous." Fear and exhilaration warred within her. To leave this room was to step into a world of unimaginable risk, but to stay was to deny the first taste of real life she had ever been offered. "Is this another part of your game, Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to face her, his gaze intense. "This is not part of the game, Miss Hayes. This is a reprieve from it." For the first time, he used her given name. "Evelyn, put on the coat." The name on his lips was both an intimacy and a command. She obeyed, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Dressed in the plain clothes, she felt anonymous, stripped of the identity of Evelyn Hayes, the heiress. She felt like someone else entirely, someone free. He led her through a series of back hallways and service elevators she had never seen, emerging not into the alley where she had first arrived, but into a private, subterranean garage. A different Ford, sleek and black, waited in the shadows. He drove himself, navigating the wet, glistening streets of Chicago with an easy, confident command. The city looked different from this vantage point. Not a distant panorama of lights, but a living, breathing entity, raw and full of menace and promise. He parked in a dark, grimy alley that smelled of stale beer and desperation. For a moment, her courage faltered. This was his world, not hers. Arthur seemed to sense her hesitation. He got out of the car and came round to her side, opening her door. He offered his hand. When she placed hers in his grip was firm and reassuring. "Stay close to me," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "You'll be perfectly safe." He led her to a battered wooden door, indistinguishable from any other in the alley. He gave a specific, rhythmic knock. A small slot slid open, and a pair of suspicious eyes peered out. They widened in recognition. "Mr. Vance, right this way, sir." The door swung inward, and they were hit by a wall of sound and heat. The air was thick with the heady cocktail of illegal gin, perfume and sweat. A river of noise flowed up the narrow staircase, the riotous sound of a jazz band in full swing, the roar of 100 conversations, the clinking of glasses. Arthur placed a firm hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive, and guided her down the stairs and into a sanctuary of sin. The cellar was a sea of humanity, packed into a low-ceilinged, smoke-filled room. Flappers with flashing beads and bobbing feathers danced with men in sharp suits, their bodies moving with a frenetic, joyful abandon. Evelyn had never seen anything like it. It was a world away from the stiff, formal balls her father hosted, where people moved like chess pieces in a game of social advancement. This was messy, loud, and gloriously, vibrantly alive. A path seemed to magically clear for them as they moved through the crowd. Arthur's presence was an invisible shield, his reputation preceding him. He led her to a small, secluded table in a dark corner, a table that was clearly always reserved for him. A waiter appeared instantly, placing 2 glasses and a bottle of gin on the table without a word. Arthur poured her a measure. "Your first taste of rebellion, Miss Hayes?" he asked, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. She looked at the glass, then at him. She lifted it and took a sip. The gin was sharp and clean, with a botanical bite that made her gasp. followed by a warmth that spread through her veins. It was the taste of defiance. But the real intoxication came from the music. On a small makeshift stage, a 7-piece band was performing miracles. The wail of a saxophone wrapped itself around the brassy punch of a trumpet. All of it held together by the frantic heartbeat of the drums and the nimble fingers of a pianist who played with his entire body. It was raw, emotional, and utterly overwhelming. It was the sound of a generation trying to forget, to celebrate, to feel something, anything in the wake of a world that had been broken. "It's everything," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. Arthur didn't look at the band. He looked at her, at the way the dim club lights caught the shimmer in her eyes, the way her lips were slightly parted in awe. He had brought her here to show her a piece of his world, but what he was witnessing was the awakening of hers. The band finished its frenetic piece to a roar of applause, then shifted into something else entirely. The tempo slowed, the trumpet was muted, and a slow, bluesy melody filled the room, a lament for the broken-hearted. Several couples moved to the small, crowded dance floor, swaying together in the smoky haze. Arthur stood and extended his hand to her. It was not a question. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She placed her hand in his, and he drew her to her feet, leading her into the throng of bodies. He pulled her close, one hand resting firmly on the small of her back, the other enveloping hers. The simple wool of her coat was a useless barrier against the heat of his body. She could feel the hard, lean muscle of his chest against her, smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne mingling with tobacco and gin. She had been taught to dance by prim instructors in sterile studios, maintaining a polite, rigid distance from her partners. This was different. This was not a dance. It was a conversation without words. He led, and she followed as if they had been doing this for a lifetime. She rested her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes, letting the music and the moment consume her. The world outside this cellar, the fact that he was her captor and she his prisoner, ceased to exist. In the smoky darkness, surrounded by the melancholy cry of the saxophone, they were just a man and a woman, bound by a dangerous and undeniable gravity. The line between raptor and protector, between enemy and something else, had not just blurred, it had evaporated in the heat between them. He tightened his grip almost imperceptibly, his fingers pressing into her back, pulling her even closer, until she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against hers. She was no longer in a gilded cage or a cellar speakeasy. She was at the calm, silent center of a hurricane, and the only thing that felt real in the entire world was the man holding her in his arms. The drive back from the speakeasy was shrouded in a heavy, brittle silence. The spell of the music and the dance had been broken the moment they stepped back into the cold, rain-washed alley. Now, inside the insulated confines of the Ford, the air was thick with everything that had been felt and nothing that had been said. Evelyn sat beside Arthur, intensely aware of the small space between them. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his hand on her back, the memory of his heartbeat against hers. The city lights streaked past the window, a blur of fractured color, mirroring the chaos of her own emotions. Arthur's hands were steady on the steering wheel, his profile stark and unreadable in the intermittent glow of the street lamps. The impulsive man who had pulled her onto the dance floor had retreated, replaced once again by the cool, controlled strategist. Yet something had irrevocably shifted between them. The carefully constructed dynamic of captor and captive had been shattered, and they were now adrift in a dangerous, undefined territory. He did not take her back to her suite. Instead, he led her back to his study, the room where she had first laid eyes on him. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, melancholy light on the room. He walked to the decanter, pouring 2 glasses of brandy this time. He handed one to her without asking. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the glass, and a jolt of electricity, sharp and undeniable, shot up her arm. She took a fortifying sip, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the sudden chill that had settled deep in her bones. She could not go back to the literary debates and musical interludes, not now. The intimacy they had shared demanded a truth she had, until now, been too afraid to seek. "That debt you spoke of," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "The one my father owes you. It isn't about business, is he?" Arthur swirled the brandy in his glass, his eyes fixed on the vortex of amber liquid. The silence stretched, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of the warmth it held when he spoke of books or music. It was a voice honed by years of containing an old and terrible rage. "No," he said. "It was never about business." He took a drink, then placed his glass on the mantelpiece, turning to face the dying fire. "My name wasn't always Vance. It was Vanchek. My father was Elias Vanchek, an immigrant, an architect with a mind full of dreams. He designed a new way of reinforcing steel, a technique that would have allowed buildings to soar higher than ever before. He was a poet who wrote in steel and concrete." Evelyn listened, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. "He had a partner," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "a man who had the money and the connections he lacked, a man he trusted like a brother. They were going to build the future of Chicago together. But my father poured everything he had into the project, his designs, his reputation, his life savings. His partner handled the finances, the patents, the city permits." He paused, and the air in the room grew thick with the weight of the past. "The partner was your father, Walter Hayes." The name landed like a physical blow. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped her glass, its cold surface grounding her as the room seemed to tilt on its axis. "One morning," Arthur said, his back still to her, "we awoke up to find our world had ended. The newspapers were full of it. Elias Vanchek, the brilliant architect, was a fraud. His designs were declared structurally unsound, his financial projections fraudulent. The patents, which my father thought were filed jointly, were solely in Walter Hayes's name. Your father held a press conference. He played the part of the betrayed partner beautifully, expressing his shock and disappointment. He announced he would salvage the project himself, using a corrected version of the designs, my father's original designs. He finally turned from the fireplace, and the embers cast his face in a grim landscape of light and shadow. The calm mask was gone. In its place was a raw, naked agony that was terrifying to behold. My father was ruined, blacklisted. No one would hire him. No one would even speak to him. We lost everything, the house, the money, our name. Walter Hayes built his empire on the foundations of my father's dream, using my father's genius, and he did it by convincing the world the man was a charlatan and a cheat. We ended up in a one-room flat in a tenement building, the smell of cabbage and despair in the hallways. My father, he wouldn't." Evelyn began, the words a desperate, reflexive defense. "He would," Arthur cut in, his voice like iron, "and he did. The final cruelty was the most elegant. He didn't have my father killed. He simply let the city he loved destroy him. Elias Vanchek died 6 months later. The doctors called it a heart attack. I called it death by 1,000 cuts of public disgrace. I was 16 years old. He walked towards her then, stopping just a few feet away, his eyes, burning with a lifetime of cold fury, locked onto hers. I buried my own father. I survived on the streets, taking any work I could find, educating myself in libraries at night. I changed my name to Vance, shedding the disgraced name of Vanchik, and I swore an oath on my father's unmarked grave that I would take back everything Walter Hayes had stolen from us. Not the money, the power. I would build an empire of my own in the shadows of his, and one day I would be strong enough to watch his world crumble into ash, just as he did to mine. The story settled over Evelyn, a suffocating shroud. This wasn't a business rivalry. It was a vendetta, a ghost story written in blood and betrayal. And she, in her silver dress and diamond headband, was the living, breathing symbol of everything he had lost. She looked at this man, the man who had shown her the vibrant, beating heart of the city, the man who had held her with such impossible tenderness on the dance floor, and saw him for what he truly was, a weapon forged and aimed directly at her father's heart. And the most terrible part was that she believed him. She had seen the casual cruelty her father was capable of, his ability to dismiss people as mere pawns in his grand game. Arthur's story, in its devastating detail, rang with the cold, hard truth of the man who had raised her. Her love for Arthur, and she could no longer deny that was what this terrifying, exhilarating feeling was, now seemed like the ultimate act of treason. To love him was to betray her own blood, her name, the very foundation of her existence. And for him to feel anything for her, that would be a betrayal of his sacred vow, of the ghost of the father he so desperately sought to avenge. "So you see, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice now quiet and weary, the fire of his rage banked for a moment. "You were never just a piece in the game. You are the game. The final move, the warmth of the speakeasy, the magic of the dance, the illusion of connection. It all dissolved, leaving behind a devastating reality. Their two worlds were not just separate, and they were built on the premise of mutual annihilation. Any bridge between them would have to be built over an abyss of hatred and sorrow." He turned and walked to the door, leaving his brandy untouched on the mantelpiece. He paused with his hand on the knob. "I should not have taken you out tonight," he said, his back to her. "It was a mistake." Then he was gone, and the soft click of the study door closing echoed the final, definitive sound of a lock sealing her not just in a sweep, but in the ruins of a love that was impossible before it had even begun. The days following Arthur's confession were a new kind of prison. The shared moments of intellectual and emotional intimacy vanished, replaced by a cold, formal distance. He no longer visited her. Her meals were brought by the stoic Frank. The silence of the exchange, a stark reminder of her status as a captive. The gramophone sat untouched, its horn a silent black mouth. The velvet cage, which had begun to feel like a strange, suspended world for two, was now just a cage again, solitary, silent, and suffocating. Evelyn was adrift in a sea of conflicting loyalties. The image of her father as a powerful, protective figure had been irrevocably fractured. She now saw him through Arthur's eyes, a man whose ambition was a destructive force, a man who built his glittering towers on the rubble of other men's lives. Yet he was still her father. The instinct to defend her own blood warred with the undeniable truth she had seen in Arthur's soul-deep pain. Her heart ached with a grief that was twofold. She grieved for the boy Arthur had been, left alone to navigate a brutal world, and she grieved for the impossible love that had blossomed between them, a fragile, beautiful thing now poised by the sins of the past. She understood now that Arthur's civility, his debates about literature, even their dance in the speakeasy, it had all been a dangerous indulgence for him, a momentary lapse in a lifelong mission of vengeance. Meanwhile, in the world beyond her gilded prison, Walter Hayes was not idle. He was a shark who smelled blood in the water, and the abduction of his daughter was a direct challenge to his dominion. He used his vast network of influence, leaning on police commissioners, judges, and the city's more legitimate underworld figures. He didn't want a quiet exchange. He wanted annihilation. He wanted Arthur Vance erased. 1 week after their night at the speakeasy, Arthur received a message. It was not a request for negotiation. It was an ultimatum, delivered by a Weasley lawyer who represented the respectable face of Walter Hayes's criminal enterprises. Arthur met him in his study, the same room where he had told Evelyn the truth. "Mr. Hayes is a reasonable man," the lawyer began, his tone oily and condescending. "He is willing to overlook this transgression." Arthur remained silent, watching the man from behind his large mahogany desk, his face an unreadable mask. "The terms are simple," the lawyer continued, placing a thin briefcase on the desk. "You will release his daughter, unharmed, at a location of our choosing within the next 24 hours. You will then liquidate your assets and leave Chicago permanently. In return, Mr. Hayes will call off the dogs, so to speak. The investigations will be dropped, the contracts on your life will be rescinded, and if I refuse," Arthur asked, his voice deceptively calm. The lawyer smiled, a thin, predatory slash. "Then Mr. Hayes will bring the full and terrible weight of this city down upon you. He will not stop until every speakeasy you own is a smoldering ruin. Every man loyal to you is either in a jail cell or a pine box, and you are rotting in a federal prison for the rest of your natural life. He will, and I quote, burn your pathetic little kingdom to the ground. And as for the girl, in a war, there is always collateral damage." The final, veiled threat against Evelyn landed like a punch to the gut. Walter Hayes was willing to risk his own daughter's life to win. In that moment, Arthur saw his enemy with terrifying clarity. Hayes didn't just want to defeat him, he wanted to humiliate him, to prove that, even with his daughter as a hostage, Arthur Vance was powerless. The lawyer left, and Arthur sat alone in his study for a long time, the ultimatum lying on his desk like a coiled snake. He had spent years planning his revenge, building his empire brick by painstaking brick. His plan had been to slowly dismantle Hayes's operations, to bleed him dry, to force him into a desperate position where he would have to face the son of the man he had destroyed. But he had not accounted for Evelyn. He had not accounted for the way her sharp mind challenged his, the way her quiet strength shone through her carefully polished exterior, the way his heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, had begun to beat again in her presence. His love for her, a feeling he could no longer deny to himself, had become his greatest vulnerability. Keeping her here no longer made her a shield. It made her a target. Walter Hayes would burn the entire city down, with her in it, just to watch him fail. His choice was brutal and absolute. He could pursue his vengeance and, in doing so, sign her death warrant, or he could sacrifice his life's purpose to save her. There was no choice at all. That evening, he went to her suite. He found her curled on the chaise lounge, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She looked up when he entered, her eyes wide and haunted. The air between them was thick with unspoken grief. He did not sit. He stood before her, his posture rigid, his face a cold, impenetrable mask. He had to make this clean. He had to make her hate him, so she would leave without looking back. "It's over," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Your father has capitulated to my initial demands. You're free to go." Evelyn stared at him, her heart sinking. The lie was so blatant, so cold. She knew her father. He would never capitulate. "What demands?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Financial considerations, territory, matters that wouldn't concern you," he said, dismissively, waving a hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. "You served your purpose admirably. You were a very effective pawn." The word pawn struck her with the force of a physical slap. It was a deliberate cruelty, designed to erase everything that had passed between them, the conversations, the music, the dance, the confession. She rose from the chaise, her body trembling with a mixture of hurt and fury. "A pawn," she repeated, her voice shaking. "After everything you told me, after that night, Was that all just part of the game, a way to keep the hostage compliant? He met her gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as obsidian. He forced himself to hold the look, to let her see the monster she had first expected. You were the daughter of Walter Hayes. Did you really believe there could be anything else? You were a means to an end. The end has been achieved. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. You are a liar, she said, her voice low and fierce. I am a gangster, Miss Hayes, he corrected her coldly. Lying is part of the trade. Now, I have arranged for your escape. It must look convincing. At midnight, the lock on your door will be disengaged. A service elevator at the end of the hall will be waiting. It will take you to the garage. A car will be there, keys in the ignition. You will drive away. My men have been instructed to be conveniently inept for a 5-minute window. Do you understand? He laid out the plan with the impersonal precision of a general briefing his troops. He was not just releasing her. He was erasing himself from her life, making her an active participant in the fiction of her own escape. He was giving her a story she could tell herself, a story where she was the clever heroine who had outsmarted her captor, not the heartbroken girl he had cast aside. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp, twisting knife in her chest. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe that somewhere beneath the vengeance and the violence, there was a man who saw her, who felt what she felt, and he was telling her it was all an illusion. I understand, she said, her voice clipped and brittle. She lifted her chin, the pride of her Hayes serving as her final armor. Don't worry, I will not be a pawn in anyone's game ever again. His expression did not flicker, but for a fraction of a second, he saw a flicker of profound pain in his eyes before the mask slammed back down. It was the look of a man tearing out his own heart. Good, he said. He turned and walked to the door, not looking back. Goodbye, Miss Hayes. The door closed behind him with its soft, final click. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the room, the silence screaming in her ears. She finally allowed the tears to fall, heart tracks of betrayal and heartbreak. He wanted her to believe she was just a piece in his game, but as she stood there, shattered, she knew, with a terrible certainty, that the heart he had just broken was not only her own. Freedom was a hollow, aching thing. Evelyn drove the Ford Model T through the pre-dawn emptiness of Chicago, the city's familiar landmarks rendered alien by her new reality. The motions were automatic, pressing the clutch, turning the wheel, navigating streets she had only ever seen from the insulated comfort of a chauffeured town car. Each block she put between herself and Arthur's hotel felt less like an escape and more like an exile. His final words echoed in her mind, a cruel, repetitive litany. Pawn, a means to an end. Did you really believe there could be anything else? She refused to go home. The thought of facing her father, of returning to the suffocating silence of the Hayes mansion, was unbearable. She was no longer his porcelain doll, and that gilded cage was now more repugnant to her than Arthur's velvet one had ever been. Using the emergency cash, her father insisted she always carry for appearances. My dear, she checked into a small, discreet hotel on the north side, registering under a false name she plucked from a novel she'd been reading. In the anonymity of the clean, Spartan room, her carefully constructed composure finally shattered. She sank onto the stiff bed, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. Her heartbreak was a cold, clean thing, a shard of glass in her soul. She had been a fool to believe that a bond forged in captivity could ever translate into the real world. Arthur Vance was exactly what he had said he was, a gangster, a man driven by a singular, all-consuming quest for revenge. She had simply been a temporary, useful tool in his war against her father. For 2 days she existed in a state of suspended animation, leaving the room only to buy newspapers. They were her only window into the world she had left behind, and it was in their bold, sensational headlines that she found the devastating truth. The papers were screaming with news of a full-scale gang war. Hayes declares war on underworld rival. Vance empire under siege. Speakeasy raided, 3 dead. The stories painted a brutal picture of coordinated attacks on Arthur's establishments, of police raids on his warehouses, of key lieutenants being arrested on trumped-up charges. It was a multi-front assault waged with the combined power of her father's thugs and his city officials on the payroll. It was total, merciless annihilation. As Evelyn read the lurid accounts, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her escape, Arthur's cold dismissal, the timing, it all coalesced into a single agonizing realization. Her father had never intended to honor any deal. The ultimatum had been a sham, a tactic to get her out of the way before he unleashed hell. Arthur hadn't capitulated. He had been checkmated. He hadn't cast her aside because she was a useless pawn. He had pushed her off the board entirely because he knew the game was about to become a bloodbath. His cruelty hadn't been an act of indifference. It had been a desperate, self-sacrificing act of protection. He had deliberately broken her heart to save her life, choosing to wear the mask of a monster so she would run from the coming inferno. He had not discarded a pawn. He had sacrificed his queen to save the board. The knowledge didn't heal her heart. It set it on fire. The grief and humiliation she had been nursing transformed into a white-hot fury, followed by a fierce, desperate resolve. She could not, would not, hide in this anonymous hotel room while the man who had truly seen her, the man who had shown her what it felt like to be alive, was being systematically destroyed by the man who had suffocated her since birth. Her father had underestimated her. Everyone had. They saw a fragile ornament. They were about to see a weapon. For years she had been a silent ghost in her father's house, privy to conversations she was not meant to hear. Her father, in his arrogance, often took calls in his study with the door ajar, his voice carrying down the marble hallways. He saw her as part of the furniture, incapable of understanding the complexities of his business, but she had listened, and she had understood. One name surfaced in her memory, a detail from a hushed, angry phone call a few weeks ago, the Pullman Yard. Her father had been furious about a delay in acquiring a decommissioned warehouse there, a secret place. A place he wouldn't want anyone to know about. A place to marshal forces, to store weapons. It was a gamble, but it was the only card she had to play. Driven by a love that felt more like a force of nature, Evelyn checked out of the hotel. She drove the Ford back into the heart of the city, into the very storm Arthur had tried to save her from. The atmosphere was palpably different. The air was tense, electric with violence. Policemen stood on street corners in nervous clusters. Newsboys shouted grim headlines. She drove to the alley behind Arthur's hotel. It was now guarded by 2 grim-faced men holding shotguns. She stopped the car, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She got out, and the guards immediately raised their weapons. "That's far enough, lady. I need to see him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I need to see Mr. Vance." "Nobody sees Mr. Vance," the first guard grunted. "Now get back in your car and go home before you get hurt." "You don't understand," she pleaded, stepping closer. "My name is Evelyn Hayes. He'll want to see me. I have information." At the mention of her name, the second guard's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Hayes, you're the reason for all this. Get out of here, now." Suddenly, a familiar, solid figure emerged from the steel door. It was Frank. His face was grim, a fresh cut bleeding sluggishly above his eyebrow. He took in the scene, his eyes widening in disbelief when he saw her. "Miss Hayes, what are you doing here? The boss got you out. You need to leave." "Frank, please," she said, appealing to the man who had been her silent, stoic warden. "You have to let me in. I know something about my father's plans. A location, the Pullman Yard." Frank's expression wavered. The name clearly meant something to him, but his orders were his orders. "I can't. It's a war zone in there. We're expecting another hit any minute. That's why you have to let me in," she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "I am not here to be saved. I am here to help him win." Her conviction, the fire in her eyes, finally broke through his soldier's discipline. He looked from her determined face to the dark, threatening street and made a decision. "Get inside," he growled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. Quickly, he hustled her through the service corridors, which were now filled with tense, armed men. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and cordite. The distant, rhythmic sound she heard wasn't music from a gramophone. It was the staccato rhythm of gunfire from the front of the building. Frank kicked open the door to Arthur's study. The scene was one of controlled chaos. The elegant room was now a command center. Maps were spread across the desk, and men with rifles knelt by the windows, which had been shattered, the cold night air pouring in. And in the center of it all stood Arthur. He was no longer the composed strategist in a tailored suit. He had shed his jacket, and his white shirt was stained with dust and what looked like blood on one sleeve. He held a Thompson submachine gun in his hands, its deadly weight looking utterly at home with him. He was shouting orders, his voice a roar, commanding bark. When he saw her, he froze. The chaos of the room seemed to fall away, the sounds of the battle fading to a dull roar. His face, already pale with exhaustion and fury, went white with a new, more profound terror. "Evelyn," he breathed, disbelief warring with horror. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was painfully tight. "What in God's name are you doing here? I got you out. You were supposed to be safe." His anger was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the undeniable truth, the confession he had refused to give her. "You didn't lie well enough," she said, her voice shaking but firm, meeting his terrified, furious gaze without flinching. "My father is consolidating his men and his arms for a final, overwhelming assault. He's doing it at a warehouse he acquired secretly. It's in the old Pullman freight yard. He thinks no one knows about it. He's planning to hit you from the back, where you're weakest." Arthur stared at her, his mind racing to process her words. The Pullman Yard. It made perfect sense. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the explanation for how Hayes's forces seemed to be everywhere at once. The sound of shattering glass from the hallway broke the spell. Frank shouted, "They're coming through the east wing." The storm was no longer at the gates. It had broken through the walls. But in that moment, as gunfire erupted from down the hall, Arthur's eyes never left Evelyn's. The fury and fear in his gaze slowly gave way to a dawning, incredulous awe. She had not come back as a victim to be rescued. She had walked back into the heart of the fire, carrying the one weapon that could extinguish the flames. She was not a pawn, and she was not a princess in a tower. She was his ally, and she had just given him a fighting chance. Evelyn's information was a lightning strike in the chaos. It was the key, the fulcrum upon which the entire war now pivoted. While half of Arthur's men held the line against the frontal assault on the hotel, Arthur, Frank, and a hand-picked team of his most trusted fighters moved with breathtaking speed, using the network of secret tunnels that ran beneath his empire like veins of iron. They raced towards the Pullman Yard. Evelyn refused to be left behind. She was no longer a fragile heiress to be sheltered, but a part of this battle, her fate inextricably linked with his. Seeing the unyielding resolve in her eyes, Arthur didn't waste precious seconds arguing. He simply handed her a small pistol. "Stay behind me. Don't use it unless you have no other choice." The weight of the cold steel in her hand was a terrifying, empowering thing. They emerged from a ventilation shaft into the cavernous, moonlit dark of the freight yard. Just as she had said, Walter Hayes's forces were massing inside a long, derelict warehouse, their backs turned, preparing for the final, decisive strike. They were confident, arrogant, and utterly exposed. What followed was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Arthur's attack was a masterpiece of strategic brutality. They hit Hayes's men from their blind side, a whirlwind of righteous fury and controlled violence. The element of surprise was absolute. The cavernous warehouse became a deafening echo chamber of gunfire and shouting as Hayes's army, caught completely off guard, descended into chaos. In the heart of the maelstrom, Arthur moved with a lethal grace, a dark, avenging angel. But his objective was not slaughter. It was to decapitate the snake. He fought his way towards the back offices, where he knew Walter Hayes would be, overseeing his victory. Evelyn stayed close, her heart hammering, the acrid smell of gunpowder burning her nostrils. She watched as Arthur, the man who debated poetry and listened to mournful jazz, became the embodiment of the vengeance that had fueled him his entire life. They found Walter Hayes not in a command post, but attempting to flee through a back exit, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. When he saw Arthur, he stopped dead. But when his eyes fell on Evelyn standing at Arthur's side, his expression curdled into one of pure, venomous hatred. "You," he hissed at his daughter, the word dripping with contempt. "You chose him, a gutter rat, after everything I gave you." "You gave me a cage," Evelyn replied, her voice ringing out in the sudden lull in the fighting. "He showed me the sky." That was the moment the last vestiges of Walter Hayes's power crumbled. Not with a gunshot, but with the quiet finality of his daughter's choice. Before he could react, Frank and another of Arthur's men had him, disarming him and binding his hands. The fight was over. The rest of his men were either captured or had fled into the night. But Arthur's revenge was not to be written in blood. He had a different, more fitting end in mind. Armed with Evelyn's testimony and the evidence seized from the warehouse, Arthur orchestrated the final, brilliant move of his long game. He didn't kill Walter Hayes. He exposed him. He delivered Hayes, along with a meticulously documented ledger of his corruption, bribery, extortion, conspiracy, to the one federal agent in the city known to be immune to his influence. Walter Hayes's empire did not fall in a hail of bullets, but under the weight of his own hubris, collapsing in a storm of newspaper headlines, federal indictments, and public disgrace. He was ruined in the exact same manner he had ruined Elias Vance. The son had delivered a poet's justice for the father. In the quiet calm that descended upon the city in the following days, Arthur and Evelyn found themselves back in his study. The shattered windows had been boarded up, the scent of cordite replaced by the familiar smell of old books and leather. The war was over. The ghosts of the past had been, if not laid to rest, then finally appeased. They stood by the window, not the shattered one, but one that overlooked the vast, sprawling city. The sun was rising, painting the horizon in soft strokes of gold and rose. It felt like the first real morning of their lives. Arthur turned to her, the exhaustion of the past weeks etched on his face, but his eyes, for the first time, were free of the shadows of vengeance. They were clear, and they were filled with a raw, vulnerable emotion that stole her breath. "I told Frank that if you ever came back," he said, his voice low and raspy, "he was to turn you away, no matter what. I was terrified you would." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was no longer a stolen intimacy in a smoky club, but a clear, deliberate truth. "And I was terrified you wouldn't. You broke my heart, Arthur," she whispered, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "I know," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I would have broken my own 1,000 times to keep you safe." The confession hung in the air, simple, profound, and absolute. It was everything she needed to hear. "What now?" she asked, looking out at the city skyline. Their pasts were ruined behind them. Their future was an unwritten page. "Now," he said, his hand sliding down to cup her jaw, gently turning her face back to his, "we build something new, something that belongs to us." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic, stolen passion, but one of deep, soul-shattering tenderness. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promises kept, of a new dawn rising after the longest of nights. It was the end of a war and the beginning of a life. Looking out at the rising sun, Evelyn knew their world would never be simple. The ghosts of Walter Hayes and Elias Vance would forever be the foundations upon which their love was built. But here, in the arms of the man who had been her captor, her protector, and her unlikely salvation, she was finally, truly free. Together, they would build their own kingdom, not of shadows and revenge, but of a fierce and improbable love that had found its own secret, beautiful melody in the heart of the storm. True love is not about finding a perfect past, but about having the courage to build a new future from the wreckage of what came before. It teaches us that sometimes the very chains we believe are meant to imprison us are forged by a destiny that leads to our ultimate freedom and redemption. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more timeless romances.